Hi, thank you for joining me. Mindy Mandell here. And today I'm going on with Plato's Laws. We're up to Book 10. Now, I do expect today's video to be a bit long, but hopefully you will find this book an enjoyable one. I find Book 10 enjoyable. And what we're looking at today is Plato's going to go into a bit more detail about what he meant by crimes against the gods, which he mentioned in Book 9. Okay, so all of the translations as I've been using throughout the laws are from Robert Gregg Bury. Okay, so he says that no one who believes as the laws prescribe in the existence of the gods has ever yet done an impious deed voluntarily or uttered a lawless word. He that acts so is in one or other of these three conditions of mind. Either he does not believe in what I've said, or secondly, he does believe that the gods exist, but they have no care for humanity. Or thirdly, he believes that they are easy to win over when they're bribed by offerings and prayers. Okay, so these are the three categories that he had just named, and these are three ways in which we could be ignorant about the nature of reality. And of course, we do need to correct these if we are seeking wisdom. So the first one is that gods do not exist. And the second one is that the gods do exist, but they just don't care about us, or they're not involved in our world. In other words, there's no providence functioning in the world. The third category is that there are gods and maybe there is some sort of providence in the world, but there's a misunderstanding about how that providence functions because these people think that the gods can be bought off or bribed in some way. Okay, so these are three areas that we need to look at. Now we're going to find that this first one, that the gods do not exist, is the bulk of Book 10, and therefore it's going to be the bulk of today's video. Okay, so surely it seems easy, stranger, to assert with truth that gods exist. So this is Clinias, and the Athenian stranger asks how so. And here's Clinias's reasoning. He says that first, there is the evidence of the earth, the sun, the stars, and all the universe, and the beautiful ordering of the seasons, marked out by years and months. And then there is the further fact, that all Greeks and barbarians believe in the existence of gods. So a bit of a simple argument, especially the idea that, well, we all believe in God, therefore that's an argument. It's not much of an argument. We've all heard the intelligent design argument, which is something of what he's giving here. So this argument has been around for a very long time, not a modern argument at all. So here's the Athenian stranger's response as to why these arguments are not successful. He says it is rather the novel view of our modern scientists that we must hold responsible as the cause of mischief. For the result of the arguments of such people is this, that when you and I try to prove the existence of the gods by pointing to these very objects, the sun, the moon, the stars, or the earth, as instances of deity and divinity, people who have been converted by these scientists, and this of course means materialist scientists, because not all scientists think the same, but they will assert that these things, the sun and the moon, etc., they're simply earth and stone, incapable of paying any heed to human affairs, and that these beliefs of ours are speciously tricked out with arguments to make them plausible. Except for that last part, I'd say it's very much what we hear even today. I think today very few people would even suggest that these arguments are plausible if they are materialists. But certainly the idea that there is no deity connected to these bodies, they're just physical bodies, is a common argument. Now he goes on, I will explain it more clearly. Fire and water and earth and air, they say, all exist by nature and chance, and none of them by art. And by means of these, which are wholly inanimate, the bodies which come next, those namely of the earth, sun, moon, and stars, have been brought into existence. Okay, so nature is inanimate, and it's from nature that the physical bodies are formed. Now notice here that nature and chance is distinguished from art. We want to look at how the materialists use these two categories, nature and art. And we're going to see as we go on that the Athenian stranger, when he's ready to defend his position, is going to give nature and art a different relationship. He says, going on with the materialist argument, that it is by chance that all these elements move, by the interplay of their respective forces, and according as they meet together and combine fittingly, hot with cold, dry with moist, soft with hard, and all such necessary mixtures as result from the chance combination of these opposites. In this way and by these means, they have brought into being the whole heaven and all that is in the heaven, and all animals too, and plants. After that, all the seasons had arisen from these elements, and all this, as they assert, not owing to reason nor to any god or art, but owing, as we have said, to nature and chance. So again, very much in line with the same arguments we hear now. The response to intelligent design is very much this. I just want to point out, by the way, as a side note, that heaven is not used by the Platonists the same way it's used by Christians. Heaven is used to describe the physical universe. And notice again that art is distinguished from nature as if they're different things. And here's a little bit more about art, explaining what art is to the materialists. As a later product of these, art comes later. As a later product of these, art comes later. And it, being mortal itself and of mortal birth, begets later playthings which share but little in truth, being images of a sort akin to the arts themselves. Images such as painting begets in music, and the arts which accompany these. So in other words, art in general is just a human invention, and then we use it to express creativity through painting and so on. Those arts which really produce something serious are such as share their effect with nature, like medicine, agriculture, and gymnastic. Politics, too, as they say, shares to a small extent in nature, but mostly in art. So politics, too, he's putting in that category of human inventions. And in like manner, all legislation which is based on untrue assumptions is due not to nature, but to art. Okay, so the materialists are not going to consider law or politics or even art itself as anything but human inventions. Now, the first statement, my dear sir, which these people make about the gods is that they exist by art and not by nature. Again, a very common argument you hear from atheists, that gods are human inventions. Of course, they're talking about our images of God, and it really doesn't touch what we mean in metaphysics by God, but this is their argument, that God is just a human invention. It exists by certain legal conventions which differ from place to place according as each tribe agreed when forming their laws. They assert, moreover, that there is one class of things that is beautiful by nature, another class beautiful by convention. While as to things that are just, they do not exist at all by nature, but people are constantly in dispute about them and continually altering them. And whatever alteration they make at any time is at that time authoritative, though it owes its existence to art and the laws, and not in any way to nature. So they look at the way law functions in our physical world. There are a lot of flaws with it. And so they think, well, that's all that law, that justice is or law is. There is no such thing as a divine law or divine justice. Now he's going to try to argue against this now. And he says that if persuasion can be applied in such matters in even the smallest degree, no lawgiver who is of the slightest account must ever grow weary, but must, as they say, leave no stone unturned, to reinforce the ancient saying that gods do exist, and all else that you recounted just now. In law itself he must also defend, and art, as things which exist by nature or by a cause not inferior to nature, since according to right reason, they are the offspring of mind. So remember that for the Platonists, mind is not just brain activity. It is something divine. And so art and law are offspring of mind, which means they're not in contrast to nature, but rather they are in the same hierarchical unfolding from nature, either before or after nature. You can question that, but they are not in opposition. Now he goes on to say that such a discourse is of the greatest help for intelligent legislation, since legal ordinances, when put in writing, remain wholly unchanged, as though ready to submit to examination for all time, so that one need have no fear, even if they are hard to listen to at first, seeing that even the veriest dullard can come back frequently to examine them, nor yet if they are lengthy, provided that they are beneficial. So he's giving a defense of discourses like this one, perhaps defending this very dialogue. Now, the Athenian stranger goes on to say that it appears that the person who makes these statements, going back to the materialist argument, holds that fire, water, earth, and air to be the first of all things, and that it is precisely to these things that he gives the name nature, while soul he asserts to be a later product therefrom. So even some materialists had the view that there is such a thing as soul. They didn't believe in divine mind or divinity or gods of any kind, but that soul, there's body, and then somehow soul springs up after it. Now he's going to counter that argument. As regards the soul, my comrade, nearly everyone appears to be ignorant of its real nature and its potency, and ignorant not only of other facts about it, but of its origin especially. How that it is one of the first existences, and it's prior to all bodies, and that it more than anything else is what governs all the changes and modifications of bodies. And if this is really the state of the case, must not things which are akin to soul be necessary prior, metaphysically prior in origin to things which belong to body, seeing that soul is older than body? So he says that soul here is what governs all the changes and modifications of bodies. As we go on, that's the case he's going to make, and we'll see how he makes it to show that soul is older than body. Then opinion and reflection and thought and art and law will be prior to things physical, like hard and soft, heavy and light. And further, the works and actions that are great and primary will be those of art, while those that are natural in nature itself, which they wrongly call by this name, will be secondary and will derive their origin from art and reason. So whereas the materialists say that there's nature and then we invent art as just this is just a human invention, what he's saying here is it's just the opposite. If you believe in divine mind, if you recognize mind as prior to the physical world, then you would also recognize that nature is actually a later outflow of this hierarchy or this let's say unfolding of reality. By nature, they intend to indicate production of things primary. But if soul shall be shown to have been produced first, not fire or air, but soul first and foremost, it would most truly be described as a superlatively natural existence. Soul is superlative to nature. Such is the state of the case, provided that one can prove that soul is older than body, but not otherwise. Okay, so that's where he's going. And to make his case, he's going to first introduce 8 kinds of motion, and you can find this at 893C through 894B. I'm just going to give it to you in a list form here. There's the circular motion around a fixed center. So the circular or the straight. There's separation and combination, decrease and increase, perishing and becoming. In addition to these 8 motions, which we find in our physical world, he's going to add 2 more. Have we now, my friends, mentioned all the forms of motion capable of numerical classification, save only 2? Well, Clinius is surprised. What 2 are you talking about? As one of the 2, let us count that motion which is always able to move other things, but is unable to move itself. In other words, it needs a push from outside, but then the wheels are turning and it can move other things. And then there's that motion which is always able to move both itself, it has self-motion, and also can move other things. And when it moves other things, then those other things are the 8 that we saw before, like combination and separation and so on. So let us count this one that I put in brown as another separate unit in the total number of motions. Thus we shall reckon as 9th on the list that motion which always moves another object and is moved by another. It needs that shove from outside. while that motion which moves both itself and another, and which is harmoniously adapted to all forms of action and passion, and is termed the real change in motion of all that really exists. So he added a little there, didn't he? It's, I presume, we shall call the 10th, most certainly. But then the Athenian stranger goes on to say that our statement about the 10th seems wrong. Logically, it is first in point of origin and power, because it's the cause of self-motion. And the next one is second to it, the one that needs a push from outside. That's the one they called 9th. Well, supposing that the whole of things were to unite and stand still, imagine our physical world just stopped, as most of these thinkers venture to maintain. Now, which of the motions mentioned would necessarily arise in it first? It must be that motion which is self-moving, for it will never be shifted beforehand by another thing, since no shifting force exists in things beforehand. So the self-moving force must be the first movement in the physical world. Now, what does all of this mean? Why is he going into all of this? Here is a drawing that my daughter was kind enough to make for me when I was covering the Republic in these videos. This is from Book 7 of the Republic, The Allegory of the Cave. Now, my daughter, being the consummate artist, she was not about to let accuracy get in the way of her artistic vision. So I will point out where her artistic license stepped in. But still, I think this gives us a pretty good idea of what is going on in the cave, and I find it helpful. I hope you do as well. So what we see inside the cave is that these people are chained, and they are watching this shadow show on the wall of the cave, mistaking it for reality. But what these shadows actually are these objects here, which are representing the realm of nature. And they move back and forth, and their shadow is cast on the wall. But the shadow is cast by this fire. The fire is needed in order to cast the shadow. Without the fire, there'd be no shadow. So now the fire should not be on a man-made stick or pole. That is artistic license, because this represents the realm of soul. Also, because this represents the realm of nature. Obviously, if you're seeing a horse's head running around without a body, it means you've probably been smoking something very strong. We wouldn't see this in nature. That, again, is artistic license, but we get the idea. That's the realm of nature. So what we're seeing here is that nature is putting these objects here. This person is walking back and forth, and that allows the shadow to move, and it seems like the shadows have motion in themselves, but actually they're getting their motion from outside. So this is causing the motion. It, however, is not the source of motion, because the source of motion is here. So this is the source of motion. It moves itself and also moves others, and it is by the fire giving that push, if you will, to put the shadow here. And so that is what the Athenian stranger is describing here in Book 10. Therefore, we shall assert that inasmuch as the self-moving motion is the starting point of all motions, and the first to arise in things at rest, and to exist in things in motion, it is of necessity the most ancient and potent change of all, while the motion which is altered by another thing and itself moves others comes second. That would be nature. And so what we see is that the soul has a certain special place in Platonic metaphysics, because even though there are higher realms outside the cave, within the cave, the soul is a kind of principle in that it is the source of motion and life within the cave. And then nature, we see here, is the second. So if we should see that this motion had arisen in a thing of earth or water or fire, whether separate or in combination, what condition should we say exists in such a thing? What you ask me is whether we are to speak of a thing as alive when it moves itself? Yes, that's right. It is alive, to be sure. Well then, when we see soul in things, must we not equally agree that they are alive? We must. What is the definition of that object which has for its name soul? Can we give it any other definition than that stated just now? It's the motion able to move itself? Do you assert that self-movement is the definition of that very substance which has soul as the name we universally apply to it? That is what I assert, the Athenian stranger says. And if this be really so, do we still complain that it has not been sufficiently proved that soul is identical with the prime origin and motion of what is, has been, and shall be, and of all that is opposite to these, seeing that it has been plainly shown to be the cause of all change and the motion in all things? Then is not that motion which, when it arises in one object, is caused by another, and which never supplies self-motion to anything, second in order, and that's nature, or indeed as far down the list as one cares to put it, it being the change of a really soulless body? Okay, so it's what gives motion, or the appearance of motion, to the shadows on the wall. Truly and finally, then, it would be a most veracious and complete statement to say that we find soul to be prior to body, and body secondary and posterior, soul governing and body being governed according to the ordinance of nature. So again, soul is what is governing or ruling within the world of the cave, within the physical world. It's what gives life and motion to those bodies, but it uses nature as its means by which to do that. And that's what we saw in the allegory of the cave. Soul drives all things in heaven and earth and sea by its own motions, of which the names are wish, reflection, forethought, counsel, opinion, true and false, joy, grief, confidence, fear, hate, love, and all the motions that are akin to these, or are prime working motions. Now, it's hard for us to think of thoughts or feelings as motions, because of course we think of motion as a physical thing. But in those realms that are beyond the physical, motion is mind. And so it's a very different way of thinking about motion, right? So as we go through these, I'm giving you some of the key points, a kind of a framework by which to read this. But it's really up to you to do the work of really internalizing it. This is a nice meditation right here, to try to feel this or see this, to sit with it and try to internalize it, a deeper contemplation or meditation. The more you put into it, really, the more you're going to get out of it. If, my good sir, we are to assert that the whole course and motion of heaven and of all it contains have a motion like to the motion and revolution and reckonings of reason, and proceed in a kindred manner, then clearly we must assert that the best soul regulates the whole cosmos and drives it on its course, which is of the kind described. So what is he describing here? The motion and revolution and reckonings of reason. Basically, this was in the Timaeus. It was called the circle of the same, and it is basically that divine motion. And what we see is that as we can talk about there being a hierarchy of realms, we can also talk about a hierarchy within realms. And so those souls that are considered the best soul would be like the highest in that hierarchy. And because it is metaphysically closest, if you will, to the divine realms, it means he's saying here that it shares that same motion. And so all of this beg the question, what is the nature of the motion of reason? The motion which moves in one place must necessarily move always around some center, being a copy of the turned wheels. And this has the nearest possible kinship and similarity to the revolution of reason. It's stated here as a question, but eventually the answer is yes. Now, when I talked about the circle of the same in my video on Timaeus, I introduced the word ousia. That's a Greek word. It's basically that intellectual act of that which is not physical being able to completely turn and look to itself and know itself. And that is the motion that he's describing here. Now, the sun's body is seen by everyone, but its soul by no one. And the same is true of the soul of any other body of living beings. There is, however, a strong suspicion that this class of objects, soul, which is wholly imperceptible to all the senses of the body, has somehow grown closely around us, and it is an object of reason alone. Therefore, by reason and rational thought, let us grasp this fact about it. What fact? If soul drives around the sun, we shall be tolerably sure to be right in saying that it does one of three things. What things? Either it exists everywhere inside of this apparent globular body and it directs it, such as it is, just as the soul in us moves us about in all ways, or having procured itself a body of fire or air, as some people argue, it in the form of body pushes forcibly on the body from outside. Or thirdly, being itself void of body but endowed with other surpassingly marvelous potencies, it conducts the body. So three ways to picture what is the relationship between soul and body. He never clarifies this one. He just kind of leaves it open for us. It's something for you to ponder. Concerning all the stars and the moon, and concerning the years and months and all seasons, what other account shall we give than this very same? Namely, that inasmuch as it has been shown that they are all caused by one or more souls, which are good also with all goodness, we shall declare these souls to be gods, the souls that are fairly close metaphysically to that circle of the same. They move in that way, and being a kind of principle in the physical world, he's going to call them gods. Whether it be that they order the whole heaven by residing in bodies as living creatures, or whatever the mode and method, those three possibilities he gave us, he's not picking one, but he says whatever that mode is, they do order things, and by one of these methods. Is there anyone that agrees with this view who will stand hearing it denied that all things are full of gods? Okay, so when we call the sun or the moon gods, it's not the physical body, those come and go, but the God is immortal and is always following that circle of the same, and that is what is referred to as the God. So that is his argument that gods do indeed exist. Now he's going to go on to address the belief that the gods, although they exist, there's no providence functioning in the world. The person who holds that gods exist but pay no regard to human affairs, him we must admonish. When you see people attaining the goal of old age and leaving behind them children's children in the highest offices, very likely you're disturbed when amongst the number of these you discover many dreadful impieties, and who, just because of these, have risen from a small position to royalty in the highest rank. So there's a lot of injustice, right? Then the consequence of all this clearly is that since on the one hand, you're unwilling to hold the gods responsible for such things because of your kinship to them. You believe in the gods, you see the gods as good, you're on team God, so you don't want to blame the gods. But on the other hand, you're driven by a lack of logic and inability to repudiate the gods. So you've come to this present morbid state of mind in which you opine that the gods do exist, but for some reason they scorn and neglect human affairs. It's not that the gods are bad, they just don't interfere in our lives. There's no providence functioning. While the gods, being good with all goodness, possess such care of the whole as is most proper to themselves. Most proper to themselves is a reference to the law of providence, which basically states that the gods are good in reality, and as the realms of reality unfold, that goodness also unfolds along with reality. And so each realm is good at its own proper station and function. And it is up to us, also having some of that goodness in us, to better understand the nature of reality, that is the seeking of wisdom. And as we do so, we can function better, or we can participate in higher realms, let's say, to the degree that we're able to, or be able to better understand how providence functions, and to bring ourselves in line with divine goodness and live in a way that is smooth, that runs more smoothly. Now to us three, the three people talking there, we're going to imagine two hypothetical people, and we want to make them answer us. Now both of these hypothetical people agree that gods exist, but one of them asserts that they can be bribed, which is our third category that I haven't yet talked about. The other one says that they neglect the small, meaning us. First, he's speaking now to the two hypothetical men, you both assert that the gods know and hear and see all things, and that nothing of all that is apprehended by senses or sciences can escape their notice. Do you assert that this is so, or what? That is what we assert. And further, that they can do all that can be done by mortal and immortal. They will, of course, admit that this also is the case. And it is undeniable that all five of us, the three real people and the two hypotheticals, we all agree that the gods are good. They're exceedingly good. Most certainly. Well, being then such as we agree, is it not impossible to allow that they do anything at all in a lazy and indolent way? For certainly amongst us mortals, idleness is the child of cowardice, and laziness is the child of idleness and indolence. So cowardice is at the head of that chain there. Cowardice gives birth to idleness, and when idleness hooks up with indolence, it gives birth to laziness. Right? That's the chain. Very true. None then of the gods is neglectful owing to idleness and laziness, seeing that none has any part in cowardice. If you don't have cowardice, you don't have any of the others. You're very right, he says. Further, if they do neglect the small and scant things of the all, they will do so either because they know there is no need at all to care for any such things, or, well, what other alternative is there, except the opposite of knowing? There is none. Shall we then assume, my worthy and excellent sir, that you assert that the gods are ignorant, and that it is through ignorance that they are neglectful when they ought to be showing care, or that they know indeed what is needful, yet they act as the worst of people are said to do, who, though they know that other things are better to do than what they are doing, yet they do them not, owing to their being somehow defeated by pleasures or pains, and of that, of course, is the very definition he had given earlier of cowardice. He says that's impossible. We affirm that all mortal creatures are possessions of the gods, to whom belongs also the whole heaven. Here's an idea that modern minds are not really comfortable with, the idea of us belonging to the gods or being possessions of the gods. But this is something Socrates has said in many places. Even at his trial, he called himself a servant of the gods. And so here's what follows. He says, that being so, it matters not whether a person says that these things are small or great in the eyes of the gods. For in neither case would it behoove those who are our owners, and if we're their possessions, they're our owners, and it wouldn't behoove them to be neglectful of us, seeing that they are most careful and most good. So it doesn't make sense, he's saying, to suggest that providence is not functioning. And so that brings us to the question of how does it function? And so that brings us to the third category, the idea that, yes, there's providence, but maybe the gods are not totally good. You might say to them, hey, here's a really big goat I'm going to sacrifice for you. So I want you to do some things for me, and you can buy them off. So this idea is the next one we have to tackle. Okay, so now we have to persuade the other hypothetical young man that all things are ordered systematically by him who cares for the world all, with a view to the preservation and excellence of the whole. That's the law of providence, whereof also each part, so far as it can, does and suffers what is proper to it. To each of these parts, down to the smallest fraction, rulers of their action and passion are appointed to bring about fulfillment, even to the uttermost fraction. So what we're seeing here, the law of providence, that there is a goodness that flows through all, where we see harmful things or negative things happening, it's not because the gods are not caring for this or that they ought to step down, reach down and pick us up, is the idea of grace, but that there's a certain systematic ordering that even the gods have to follow. That's the law of providence. Remember back in book 4, we saw the idea that even though chance and occasion are in our lives, there's also this idea of art, the idea of how wisdom functions. He used the example of like a ship's captain. A captain who is skillful will still get caught in storms sometimes, but the captain who is skillful will be able to get out of more storms than the captain who's not. And Even when a captain does get caught in a storm, it's unavoidable sometimes. The skilled captain is the one you would trust more. And so there is still a role for wisdom in this ordering. And so that is also the law of providence, that the wiser we become, the more we're able to participate in this, and understand really this divine ordering. So he says that all things that share in soul change, and soul is the cause of motion, since they possess within themselves the cause of change, and in changing they move according to the law and the order of destiny. And so where we see evil or hurtful things, when we wonder, why do good things happen? Or why do bad things happen to good people? It's not because there is a lack of providence in the world or a lack of goodness. It's because there is ignorance in the world as well, and it's up to us to go through this sort of education. And this is what we all need. He says, for seeing that we have agreed among ourselves that the heaven is full of many things that are good, and of the opposite kind also, because there's a lot of ignorance, and that those that are not good are more numerous. Ignorance is infinite, really. Such a battle, we affirm, is undying, and it needs a wondrous watchfulness. The gods and daimons being our allies, and we the possession of the gods and daimons. And what destroys us is iniquity and insolence combined with folly, ignorance. And what saves us is justice and temperance combined with wisdom. And that was the art as described in Book 4. It dwells in the animate powers of the gods, and of which some small trace may be clearly seen here also, residing in us. And that is the need of the education of the soul. All right, so that brings us to the end of Book 10. If you like what you're seeing, as always, I do appreciate a thumbs up. Just takes a second to hit the button. And if you have any questions or comments, you can leave them below. There's also an email address in the description box. So I do hope you will join me next week for Book 11. Thank you very much.